Hey guys, welcome to my assignment breakdown series where I pull back the curtain and show you what it's like to go on a professional shoot and work as a photojournalist for some of the most prestigious international publications in the world. Today I'm going to share with you a terribly tragic stampede I covered for the New York Times in Phnom Penh, Cambodia. Several hundred people lost their lives. And I'm not gonna lie to you, this one still kind of haunts me emotionally. Before we get into things, I'm Justin Mott, and if you're new here, my channel is dedicated to all things photography from the perspective of a full-time working professional photographer. So if that sounds like a channel that interests you, you should consider subscribing. So yeah, this was a hard one for me and kind of a hard one for me to relive, but I thought it makes sense for the series, so I'm gonna kind of talk you through it. So I remember waking up at 5 a.m. to my phone buzzing on my desk in my tiny apartment here in Hanoi. I was most likely hungover because I was partying quite a bit in between assignments. Whenever I had a few days off, I would kind of hit the bars up pretty hard. I saw a New York area code, so I promptly pick up the phone to an editor at the New York Times frantically asking me if I'd seen the news. And because it was 5 a.m., I wanted to make a snarky comment like, why would I be watching the news at 5 a.m.? Anyway, it was the big boss calling me, the foreign desk editor. He was fairly new at the New York Times, and a call was always just quite rare, as an email usually did the job for assignments. So I knew something big happened. I hadn't worked with this editor much at the time, but he was kind of a no-nonsense dude, a former war photographer and wire service photographer. Very serious and straight to the point. So a stampede had happened during a festival in Cambodia the night before. It happened really late in the evening. Several hundred people had died, and he wanted me on the next plane there to cover the story with their staff writer out of Bangkok. So I checked all the flights. I called the airline as you did back then. I called my travel agent as you did back then as well. No flights, nothing until 3 p.m. I checked connecting flights to other cities, every possible option you can consider. I checked for hours and just absolutely nothing. My editor messaged me about an hour later for an update, and I said there was no flights until 3 p.m. Hanoi is not exactly a hub. So I just had to wait. My editor wasn't happy about that. He was kind of pissed, actually. And he answered, like, why aren't you just at the airport? Like, just go there and just figure it out. I'm like, well, like, no, I can't. I can't, like, go there and, like, show a New York Times badge and, like, commandeer a flight. There wasn't options. And you never want to upset your editor because they're essentially your boss in these assignments. But yeah, I'm not gonna lie, he was kind of an ass, and which was later like the consensus about him when he was forced out. But he was kind of a jerk to me about it because I really didn't have any other options. But anyway, I booked the 3 o'clock flight to arrive in Phnom Penh around sunset. I wasn't sure how many days I'd be there. I didn't know how long the story would take. I didn't know if we'd do other stories on top of that, as sometimes I would do with the writer. So I packed a few pairs of jeans, a couple t-shirts, and for kit back then, I think I was using 2 Canon 5D Mark IIs and a couple prime lenses. And another note here, guys, I always kept my batteries charged. Back then, I still do, because when things like this happen, you have to be ready to go. So typically, back then when I was doing a lot of these like on-the-fly assignments, I always had my batteries charged, ready to go, and I always had my gear ready to go. So once I booked the flight, I called the writer to strategize about our plan for the coverage. He was arriving much earlier, as Bangkok is a hub, and he was able to get there earlier. So the game plan was for me to go right from the airport to the hospital where the bodies were piling up, and I would capture that scene there. He had already been there and gave me a little brief about what was happening there, and he wouldn't be joining me directly. He was at the hotel finishing up his interviews and prepping his story and checking facts for his deadline. So the deadline was tight for me, again, directly from the airport to the hospital, shoot for about 2 to 3 hours, and then file my images to the server so it could make the next day's International Herald Tribune. They have the international version, and then they have the national version of the New York Times, or at least they did back then. So the scene at the hospital upon arrival was chaotic, as you would imagine. At first, they didn't grant me access. The security didn't grant me access to the hospital, but I always carry this like generic press card / ID with me. I have a few of them. And I just like would write the New York Times on it, write my name, and write freelancer. It wasn't like a lie, it was accurate, but it wasn't official. But some people just saw it as official. So I'd carry like 3 of them to make me look more important, more official. I showed them that, and that seemed to work, and it got me in. And once I was in, I didn't even consider for a second to leave, just fearing that I wouldn't be allowed back in. It was overwhelming at first for me, but I settled in, I took it all in, and I just started to digest everything happening around me. They had a huge area of bodies on tarps waiting to be identified. They had a message board of sorts with the names of the deceased, and people coming in from all over the countryside looking for their missing loved ones after they heard about the story on the news. And so I just looked, I wandered, I photographed. I was there for this exact moment when this woman identified her sister's body. It was terribly sad. It was emotional. I can clearly remember having the camera up to my eye and like remembering the tear dropping down my cheek and onto my camera. I can remember that moment, and I I do remember that moment every time I look at this picture, which is more often than you think because you're always sort of going through your website, going through your archives. This moment actually haunts me quite a bit. So she seemed to be okay with my presence. I respected her space and I kept my distance, and she allowed me to stay with her for a little while. So I focused on telling this story through her the best that I could. When someone verbally or just with their body language allows me into their space, especially with something like this, so sensitive, I respect that space, but I also stay with them as long as I can, as long as it feels okay, just in order to do the story justice. So the few hours I was there were frantic, filled with chaos, confusion, grief, hysteria, human emotion, like all around me as I bounced from room to room of dead bodies, trying to tell a complete story the best I could. And I'm not gonna lie, like it's hard, man. Like this was one of the harder assignments I've ever done. I'm not gonna BS and try to sound hard here. I'm a big softie, but I can also focus immensely in these situations on getting images. It's not because I don't care. I don't compartmentalize like some journalists claim to, or use that to justify not like respecting people and their space. I guess what I mean is like I don't compartmentalize other people's emotions. I'm very well aware of that, and I care about that when I'm in the moment, when I'm taking pictures. But I compartmentalize my own emotions, I suppose, if that makes sense. At least in the moment I do, so that I can focus on all the variables that go into capturing a moment. I mean, the photos will live with me forever, so I can process those emotions down the road. But at the time, I'm present and I'm focused on photography and telling an accurate story, if that makes sense. And I should also make a note here, and not to toot my own horn too much, but I often hear photographers in other genres or amateurs talk about wanting to do photojournalism from time to time, or say things like, I'd love to occasionally take on jobs like that, or can I just get an assignment for the New York Times with no experience? And like, maybe you could, but more likely you should have proper training. Situations like this aren't easy to cope with, let alone cover them in an accurate and creative way, which is what top publications demand in their photographers. I guess this is my cocky way of saying it's not as easy as it looks. It's not street photography or travel photography. Not just anyone can or should do it. Not to knock those other genres. I do those other genres. I've done them at a high level, but it's a whole different ballgame working as a photojournalist. There's a whole different level of responsibilities and ethics that go along with it. So I just want to point that out. So I went back to my hotel. I went through the images. I captioned the images. I checked everything with the writer, filed everything to make the international version of the New York Times, and then also to make online of the national version. And then I had a next day to go out and shoot a little bit, make the following day's paper for the US version of the New York Times. Again, back then, it was split into international and national. So the next morning, I went with the writer to capture sort of the aftermath. I went to the location of the bridge where the people had died. There was monks there praying at the location, people paying their respects, people just trying to process it all. It was a whirlwind of emotions. I mean, several hundred people had died right in that location just the night before. Often people ask me about the ethics of it all, like how do you justify it in your head being there? I'm sure I've been wrong before and I've misread the situation before, but this time I feel like I didn't disturb anyone. I felt like I needed to be there. I felt like someone had to tell this story. This is the type of story that needs proper reporting, visuals to make people read it, and people in government positions make changes like this to future festivals like this, so tragedies like this don't happen. That's at least my hope, so that's why I do it, and that's how I justify it all in my head. My job is to document truth and hope others make it right and make changes. That's my naive hope, at least, and I feel like I did my job graciously. And yeah, sometimes you can make a difference, and sometimes you don't, but my job is just to go there and take the images and tell the story and to get the story out there and hope changes are made. So that's it. This was a sad one. It's probably a tough one to watch. I know a lot of people come to YouTube to maybe be like happy. Sorry, this is a tough one. It was a tough one for me to cover. I just want to share it with you. This series will be a mix of some happy stories and some sad stories. Anyway, thank you guys for tuning in. This doesn't feel right to promote anything on this one, so I won't. Just give me your feedback in the comments section. I'm really enjoying reliving a lot of these stories, maybe not this one so much, but I'm enjoying sharing them with you guys, going back through my images. So let me know if you guys have any feedback on how to improve. I want to do so. I want to do more of these. I've got a whole archive. I've done a lot of work. I've done a lot of assignments in the past decade and a half. So I'd love to share them with you guys. Let me know what you think. Thank you guys for tuning in. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and don't forget to have a wonderful day.